All right, today we're going to get into one of the absolute spookiest stories in modern aviation. We're talking about Helios Airways Flight 522. This was a plane that basically became a ghost ship in the sky, flying for hours on autopilot while everyone inside was, well, seemingly frozen in time. It's a real-life mystery. Seriously, think about that for a second. What does happen when a plane just flies itself? It sounds like a movie plot, right? But this wasn't science fiction. On August 14, 2005, it was a terrifying reality. You have this massive airliner, packed with people, just cruising along for hours, completely silent. No one talking to the ground, no one in control. How on earth can something like that happen? Well, we're gonna dig in and find out. So to really get this, we're not gonna start at takeoff, no. We're jumping right into the middle of the chaos. Picture this, you're in Athens. You look up and you see a Boeing 737, but it's weird. It's just flying in circles, completely silent, not answering a single radio call. For the people on the ground, in air traffic control, this was an absolute nightmare unfolding in real time.
Okay, so let's break down how this all went down. At just after 9 a.m., Helios 522 takes off from Cyprus. Everything seems totally normal. But then, only 30 minutes later, at 9:37, radio silence. Nothing. The plane just keeps flying on autopilot, following its flight plan like a ghost. For more than an hour, it flies like this, completely unresponsive, heading straight for Athens. Things get so tense that by 11:05, the Greek Air Force has to scramble F-16s to go up there and see what in the world is going on.
And what those F-16 pilots saw, man, it's the stuff of nightmares. They get right up next to this Boeing 737, peer into the cockpit, and it's just chilling. The co-pilot is slumped over the controls, completely motionless, and the captain, he's not even in his seat. It's empty. Then they look back into the cabin and they see all the little yellow oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling, but nobody's wearing them. The question is just screaming, what happened inside that airplane?
So, to figure this all out, we've got to go back in time, all the way back to before the plane even took off. See, this whole disaster didn't start with some massive explosion or a mechanical failure mid-air. Nope. It started quietly, on the ground, with one tiny little switch that somebody forgot about.
It turns out, right before this flight, the plane was in for some routine maintenance. The ground crew was doing a check on the pressurization system. You know, the thing that keeps the air inside breathable at high altitudes. And to run this test, they had to flip a switch in the cockpit. You've probably heard of the Swiss cheese model for accidents, and this is a textbook tragic example. So imagine every safety check is a slice of Swiss cheese. A single hole isn't a problem, but when all the holes line up, disaster gets through. First slice, the ground crew finishes their test and forgets to put the pressurization switch back to auto. Hole number one. Second and third slice, the pilots, for whatever reason, missed this error during their pre-flight checks and their after-takeoff checks. The holes are all lined up, the danger is now on board and in the air.
Now here's where it gets really bad. As the plane starts climbing, this loud alarm starts blaring in the cockpit. But here's the fatal flaw. The alarm for a dangerous loss of cabin pressure sounded exactly the same as an alarm for a takeoff configuration issue, something that really should only happen on the ground. So the pilots, probably already getting a little fuzzy from the lack of oxygen, hear this alarm and think, that can't be right, we're already in the air. They figured it was a glitch. They even radioed the ground crew about it and nobody could figure it out. And that was the last time anyone on the ground ever spoke to them.
So the crew thinks it's a false alarm. The plane keeps climbing higher and higher into the sky. With every foot it climbs, an invisible killer starts to creep through the cabin. And that killer has a name, hypoxia. It's basically just your body being starved of oxygen. But what makes it so terrifying, especially for a pilot, is how sneaky it is. It doesn't make you gasp for air or feel pain. Instead, you get confused. Your judgment goes out the window. Some people even feel a little euphoric. You're becoming dumber by the second, right at the exact moment you need to be at your absolute sharpest to save your own life. Yeah, just look at this. It really shows you how dire the situation becomes. Down here at sea level, no problem. But as that unpressurized plane climbs, the amount of time you have to actually do something, what they call the time of useful consciousness, it just plummets. When Helios 522 got to its cruising altitude, 34,000 feet, the pilots had maybe less than 60 seconds to figure out what was happening and get their oxygen masks on before they were completely incapacitated. Less than a minute. And that right there is the core of this whole tragedy. That one little switch was still on manual. The plane climbed, but the cabin never pressurized. It was like they were standing on top of Mount Everest. Within just a few minutes, everyone, all the passengers, all the crew, slipped into unconsciousness from hypoxia. And the plane? It just kept flying, a ghost ship guided only by its autopilot. Okay, so now we have to talk about the final, heartbreaking moments of this flight, because it turns out there was one last, heroic attempt to prevent the inevitable.
Think about that. 121 people on board, 115 passengers, 6 crew members. All of them victims of this silent killer. At least, that's what everyone thought.
Because incredibly, one person was still conscious, a flight attendant, Andreas Pradamu. Now, he also happened to have a commercial pilot's license, and he'd been trained as a scuba diver, so he knew the effects of hypoxia. It seems he managed to get to the portable oxygen bottles and use them to stay awake. Can you imagine what the F-16 pilots were thinking? They're flying alongside this ghost plane, when suddenly, a figure appears in the cockpit and sits down in the captain's chair. It was Pradamu. He was trying to fly the plane. But he wasn't qualified to fly a 737. He was in an impossible situation. He managed to get out one very faint mayday call, but it was just too late. Almost the exact moment he got into that seat, the left engine flamed out. It was out of fuel. The plane started to bank and descend. He was fighting the controls, trying to keep it level, but without power and with no experience on this specific aircraft, there was nothing he could do. Just a few minutes after that, the right engine died too.
At 4 minutes past noon, after flying for hours as a ghost ship, Helios Flight 522 finally crashed into a hillside near a town called Grammatico in Greece. Tragically, there were no survivors.
So, after the crash, the big question was, how do we make sure this never, ever happens again? The investigation that followed would change aviation safety forever.
The final report pretty much confirmed everything we've talked about. It was that classic Swiss cheese accident. Not one big thing, but a whole chain of smaller mistakes. A procedural error on the ground, a design flaw in the alarm system, and the unavoidable consequences of human physiology that all lined up perfectly to create the disaster. And the impact was huge. Helios Airways, the airline, it went out of business. But way more importantly, this crash sent a shockwave through the entire aviation industry. Airlines all over the world immediately started rewriting their checklists. Now there are multiple, very specific checks to make sure that pressurization switch is set to auto before every single flight.
And that's really the legacy of Helios Flight 522. It's just this incredibly stark reminder that in any complex system, whether it's an airplane or anything else, it's often the simplest, smallest oversight that can bring the whole thing down. One switch, one missed checklist item. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about all those other silent threats, the ones hiding in plain sight, that we might be missing every single day.